And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan, and we're going to continue with this podcast, looking at the distinction between gross domestic product and aggregate expenditures, and we're actually now going to add a new concept, which is going to be our equilibrium gross domestic product. We'll come back to that idea at the end. First of all, let's do some corrections here. As I said on a previous video, we now need to talk about this vertical axis being aggregate expenditures. That's on the vertical axis. And what is aggregate expenditures? We said aggregate expenditures is two things. It's consumption plus, not gross investment anymore. The aggregate expenditures is going to be consumption plus planned investment, not gross investment, but planned investment, because remember the distinction between aggregate expenditures and real GDP, the difference between those two things is unplanned investment or changes in inventory. When changes in inventory are zero, then GDP and aggregate expenditures are the same thing, and that happens on this 45-degree line. So let's say that a country is producing at a gross domestic product of, let's just pick a spot right here. Let's say that's the gross domestic product is Y2. Might be 18 trillion or whatever the number might be. And they're producing this many goods and services. At this level of gross domestic product, the total production measured on the vertical axis is going to be right here on the 45-degree line, because the 45-degree line is Y, which is where and is also when the GDP and aggregate expenditures would be equal if there was no unplanned inventory, unplanned investment, if there was no changes in inventory. But that's not the case, as we're going to see in a moment. So you go to the 45-degree line, and that's your level of production. That dot represents the level of production. And then if you come up to the aggregate expenditure line, that says that at this level of gross domestic product, at this level of production, which is also the total income in the country, at this level of income, this dot right here would be the total spending. It's the total amount of spending. That's what aggregate expenditures means, is total spending in society. So what we can see here is that at this level of production, the gross domestic product, the production right here, is greater than the total amount of spending that's going on in society. Now, if production is greater than spending, that means that companies are producing things that people don't buy. Those things that they produced and nobody bought are going to go on the shelf and are going to become inventory. So that's going to cause an increase in inventories. That's going to cause inventories to rise. The amount of stuff that companies have produced that is now sitting on a shelf is going to rise. And if inventories go up, companies want some items in inventories all the time. But if these inventories start to get too high, companies are going to respond to that by decreasing production. They don't want all these inventories, all these things just sitting around on a shelf. So if they're producing more than people are buying, and they didn't realize that, they weren't planning on that, they thought what they were producing people were going to buy, but people aren't buying it, well, that's going to cause inventories to rise. That's unplanned investment, and that's going to cause companies to respond by decreasing production. They're going to respond by decreasing production. So right here is the difference. Right here is the change in inventory. Right here is the unplanned investment, where production is greater than spending. And so companies will respond to that, to the rising inventories, by decreasing production, and production will begin to fall. Now, let's do that going the other way. If gross domestic product happened to be down here at Y3 for whatever reason, if that was the level of gross domestic product, well, then we would come up and we'd say, okay, the amount of spending on the aggregate expenditure line right here, that dot would be the amount of spending going on in society, the total spending, and the total production is always going to be on the 45-degree line. That's your gross domestic product. That's your spending, producing. So your total production is going to be down here. So that means that spending is now greater than production, and in between there is going to be changes in is going to be changes in inventory. So what does that mean? That means that at this level of GDP, the aggregate expenditures, the total spending in society, is now greater than the total production. So if people are buying stuff faster than companies produce them, then where the company is going to get these extra units to sell to the customer, where they're going to get them out of inventories. That's going to cause inventories to fall. Inventories are going to begin to fall. So if spending is greater than production, companies are going to make up for that by selling their products that they have on the shelf that they weren't planning on selling. They're going to sell it, and that's going to cause inventories to go down. And when inventories go down, that's going to cause a decrease in production. That's going to cause a sorry, I just said that wrong. Here, let's back that up. I apologize. Let's get rid of that. What did I say wrong? What I said inventories decrease. That was correct. If inventories go down, companies are going to respond to that by wanting to replenish the inventories. They're now going to have too few items stored up on their shelves compared to what they wanted. So they're going to replenish their inventories, I should have said, by increasing production. Sorry for that mistake. So when inventories go down, companies respond to those low inventories by increasing production. They're looking at their shelves and they're saying, oh man, we hardly have any stuff here on our shelves to sell customers, so we need to increase production. We need to replenish our inventories. So GDP is then going to rise. So all natural forces are going to be leading us to right here, and that's going to be extremely important. So if production is greater than spending, inventories are going to rise, and companies are going to respond to those excessive inventories by cutting production. If spending is greater than production, companies are going to respond to those depleting inventories by increasing production to replenish some of those inventories. And that will happen until we get to this point right here. What's really important about this point? This intersection point, is where total production is equal to total spending. So that means the gross domestic product is equal to aggregate expenditures. If that's true, then that means that inventories are going to remain constant. My little line over top means stay constant. There's no change in the inventories. We are producing the exact amount of the good that the consumer wants, that the consumer is willing to buy. And now we still have some things in inventory, but the inventories are right where we want them. Our inventories did not change. We didn't get an increase in inventory. We didn't get a decrease in inventory. And therefore, we're going to keep our production the same. We're going to keep our production right where it is. So production's going to, that line over top means remain constant. So all natural forces, all natural economic forces are going to lead us to this equilibrium gross domestic product. That's the big idea. And that happens right here at this point, at this intersection point between the 45-degree line and the aggregate expenditure curve, where production is equal to spending and inventories don't change, and companies keep production where it is. Production does not change. So all natural forces will drive us to equilibrium. We'll talk more about the importance of this equilibrium and then what happens when things change on a future podcast. Thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan, and we'll see you on the next podcast.